Welcome to this week's episode of the AccuWeather Podcast, Everything Under the Sun. I'm your host, meteorologist Regina Miller. And it's been more than 3 weeks since Category 5 Hurricane Dorian struck the Abaco Islands and then Grand Bahama, and much of the area still lies in ruins. In its wake, at least 53 confirmed dead and more than 1,300 people missing. AccuWeather's Jonathan Petramala was one of the first news crews on the scene. We're checking in with him to talk about the stories of some of the survivors he met who rode out the storm, about what was lost, what remains, and what more is needed. Stay with us. Well, I'm joined on the phone now by Jonathan Petramala. And actually, Jonathan, I'm catching up with you. My goodness, there's like one situation after another. I'm catching up with you at the time of this podcast on your way east in southeast Texas, right? You've been following the flooding from Imelda.
Yeah, it's kind of incredible. The last two tropical systems that I've been a part of, from Hurricane Dorian, one of the strongest hurricanes ever to make landfall, the strongest ever to make landfall in the Bahamas, to something that was barely named a tropical storm, but has caused some significant problems, some of the worst flooding that southeast Texas has seen since Hurricane Harvey. So it just goes to show how dynamic these tropical cyclones and systems are, and how many problems they can cause, whether it's the absolute catastrophic wind damage, catastrophic storm surge, to just immense amounts of rainfall.
Right. It's been a really tough situation for them just east of Houston. I know Beaumont was pretty bad. But I wanted to touch base with you and kind of catch up with you regarding the Bahamas and Dorian and kind of recapping how bad was the destruction, because I wanted to know also where we stand now. So can you talk to me about your visit following Dorian?
Yeah, we were the first journalists to be able to fly over and show the world kind of what Dorian had left behind. Obviously, the satellites had shown us how powerful this system was, and so we, of course, knew that it was bad. But we had flown in, still it was tropical storm conditions in a helicopter. The storm was still kind of hovering over Grand Bahama when we were going into the Abacos. And from above right away, you kept doing double takes at what you were seeing. Really well-constructed homes that were built to really stringent codes, and to see some of the damage that they had sustained was terrifying. But really what was scary, what we later found out, was an area called the Mud, an area that, basically just planks and plywood where Haitian immigrants had moved into and had been living, was wiped completely away. And that's when you knew this was going to be a very, very tragic hurricane with a lot of lives lost because of that. The next day we were able to get on the ground, and it was even worse because it was up close and personal. And you saw, again, that devastation, and it was unrecognizable to people that have lived there for so long. Just going a few blocks away from where they were, they couldn't believe what they were seeing, even though they had gone through this. And to a person, every single person I talked to, that they said they wish they would have left, because they'd been through so many hurricanes before, and they knew this one was going to be bad, but it was worse than they could have even imagined it would be. No matter what people were saying, meteorologists were saying, the descriptions of what was coming, nothing could even match how bad it was. When you're talking about winds sustained 185 miles per hour, gusting well over 220 miles an hour, and then you had storm surge 20 to 30 feet. The people I met and the people I spoke with, whether it's in the Abacos or Grand Bahama, I called each and every one of them a walking miracle, because that's what they are. I don't know how they survived.
Well, and the thing was, too, Jonathan, it was a long-term storm. I mean, it took a long time here over the Bahamas that they were hunkered down trying to deal with this. So that was different from some of the other disasters you've seen, right?
And you can imagine trying to live through around 2 days straight of winds, 185 miles per hour damage that you really maybe typically see in a major tornado, a large tornado, an EF4, EF5. That's the kind of damage we were kind of looking at. And again, the homes there are built to really withstand hurricanes. A lot are very solid concrete, reinforced with rebar, but I was seeing building after building constructed with very strong construction materials just crumbled. They were rubble. They didn't have anything standing. Wow. That's what was so incredible. And to hear the stories of how people were swept away by the storm surge and just miraculously either hung on to treetops, grabbed onto a car, and were just there for hours upon hours. The eye of the hurricane actually, especially when it came over the Abacos, probably saved a lot of lives just because people that thought they were in very safe spots, and then when that initial eye wall came in and the storm surge came with it, a lot of their shelters were crumbling. So they were able to reposition, and that's what saved their life because they were able to get to either higher ground or to safer buildings. It's just, again, a miracle that more people weren't killed in this.
I can't imagine what that is like. So, you've got really a window of opportunity just with the eye to get moving.
Yeah, it's something you really don't think about. But in this case, I heard story after story, people saying, yeah, the eye probably saved my life. I was able to get my family here, or I was able to get out of this. I was able to swim to there. So, yeah, it was incredible. Wow.
Do you have any particular survivor story that really just stood out to you?
There's so many, just so many survivor stories. I think I spoke to one gentleman, and again, when I met up with these people, we were the first kind of outsiders they had seen. And so a lot of people wanted me just to take photos and video of them so their family, on the off chance they might be watching, could know that they were alive, because they were cut off from communication for, at that point, about 4 days. And so just that's how I ran into a lot of people. And one gentleman, he and his family were trapped up to their necks in water with the storm surge. He was able to kind of swim out. He saw a large boat, probably a 40-foot boat, had floated into his front yard.
Wow.
So what he had done, he attached a rope to the bow of the boat, the front of the boat, and he was able to get his family and a dog into that boat. And that's where they rode out the initial eye wall. After the eye came ashore, they were able to swim to higher ground and to a church that was doing okay structurally. So that's how they were able to save their lives, though, was riding out in that boat. He said he looked at the ignition, he saw that the keys were in it, so he said if they have to, they at least could maneuver with the boat, hopefully. So that was their best option, if you can imagine that.
Wow. Well, I know you visited, one of your stops included the Humane Society there. I have a piece from that story. Let's listen to it for a second, then we can talk about it.
And I saw coming into the building, saw getting so high, we try to save some animals, try to get them on higher ground. Then I see we had to try to save ourselves.
Life and death, honestly, because the water was coming so fast and it was rising so high. This was our only chance.
Crying and screaming, and we know that they needed help, and we couldn't help them. That was the most heartbreaking.
So, Jonathan, this was just one of the heartbreaking stories. They thought they were safe there, right? So tell me about that situation.
Grand Bahama most recently was devastated by Hurricane Matthew a couple of years ago. And that, up to that point, had brought the most storm surge, the strongest winds, the most damage to Grand Bahama, where Freeport is. And so they thought they had seen the worst, as I mentioned, but that is also the island where Dorian sat for nearly 2 days. Fortunately, it was on the east end of the island, so it was away from Freeport far enough that they didn't have the extensive wind damage that you saw in the Abacos, like in Grand Marsh Harbor, but they did have extensive flooding, to the point where, unfortunately, the Humane Society, they weren't in an evacuation zone, so they were bringing in animals to board, because there are no pet-friendly shelters in the Bahamas. So people can't go to shelters with their pets. So they would board them in that Humane Society. And unfortunately, water came up 7 to 10 feet into many of the kennels. There were 6 employees that were riding the storm out there, but it got to the point where they tried to get as many animals to high ground as possible. They tried to open as many kennels as possible, but the water was rushing in so fast that they had to climb to safety into the attic of the Humane Society. 2 of those workers alone had 3 dogs there, so their own pets were being boarded there during the storm. So you can imagine they're hearing the cries, the whining, the barking, and just how horrific that would be to know these innocent creatures that they obviously love as an employee of the Humane Society, and they're helpless to do anything about it while they know that water is rising there. So they're listening to that all night long. The 2 girls crawl down when the water had receded enough that they could at least be at chest deep, and they wade over to the kennels, and miraculously, their pit bull, Libby, had kept the other two dogs, these two little Shih Tzus, on her shoulders during the surge and during the entire storm. She was able to kind of stand up enough and paddle enough and let these other two little dogs on their shoulders. So all three of those dogs were okay, and they survived. Unfortunately, the number of dogs, though, that did not make it, the executive director told me around 100. I've seen numbers that were far greater than that, but again, this is from the executive director to me in person. She said around 100 dogs, unfortunately, were killed, including 30 that had been just boarded there by owners who had taken shelter in a human
just
shelter.
Trying to ride out the storm.
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously one of the tragic stories. Still, miracles happened from that story, but I mean, it was heartbreaking. It brought tears to my eyes.
Yeah,
as
mine
I was
too.
talking with people.
That's what I was going to say. My eyes were kind of watering just hearing the story, and then, it's interesting to me that some rescuers are not even human. Yeah,
I mean, it's incredible, the will to live, the will to survive, and how that you speak to these people, you're like, how did you not give up after 2 straight days where you're trying to push against a door to keep the wind, the roof from blowing off or the room from collapsing? It's just unbelievable. Another woman who, she was in her lazy boy recliner. The roof collapses on her. This is in Marsh Harbor. She wakes up. She's underneath all this rubble. Her husband doesn't even know if she's alive. He tells their family dog, Princess, a German Shepherd, go find Mama. The dog was able to crawl through the debris, find a hole, finds the woman, sits on her, lays on her, trying to protect her for 17 hours.
Wow. Until
finally people were able to rescue her and get her out from the rubble. We got video of her and talked with her as she was being airlifted to Nassau, where a lot of folks were being airlifted. She has a broken hip, but she's doing good. So that's great. It's great news. Good.
Now, as far as responding to some of these island disasters, because I know you were in Puerto Rico, after Maria, and how painfully slow recovery and restoration had been, so what was it like here in the aftermath? How has the response been, and how do you think they're doing?
From what we speak to the Bahamians themselves about their government, and their government response is poor, to say the least. It's so overwhelming for them as a small nation. You can imagine this is such a large scale disaster that they just weren't able to respond in an efficient manner. Plus, this is an island that is used to running a certain way. It runs a lot with red tape and bureaucracy. So just to get the aid there and as quickly as it was needed was virtually impossible for the first few days, which is so important because people, of course, survive the storm, but sometimes the aftermath is even more difficult than the actual storm itself. So there was a lot of red tape, a lot of inaction, a lot of uncertainty. But time and time again, and I say this from any disaster, people, normal people, average people from the United States, from all over the world, they came to help as quickly as anyone, more quickly than any government. And they got in there right away with water, with food. Charities like Samaritan's Purse, World Kitchen with Chef Andres from Puerto Rico, they came in with food. Some of the first food that these people had seen in Marsh Harbor in 3 or 4 days. So you can imagine that. But it was really just the effort from the United States as well. Folks coming over in boats, their own personal boats. They're flying their own helicopters. They're flying their own planes. That saved a lot of lives, and it had nothing to do with any governmental agency. The Coast Guard as well, amazing work going in there with those strong hurricane force like winds to Marsh Harbor and evacuating some of the worst injured early on after this storm. Saved a lot of lives as well, and that was really impressive to see.
Yeah, I'm sure it would be. Now, do you know, is there any way people can kind of help or donate that you know of in your travels there?
I mean, I think people really need to be smart about where they donate their money in any disaster. And you need to do your due diligence, your own research. Charity Star, Charity Navigator, I believe, is a website that you can go to look at that and to see how much money's and where's going, where that money's going and what that money's going towards as well, not just administrative costs. And so I think that folks need to look at that and know that at this point, it's really about the money. the money is what really is needed for this. And then at the very least, if you can, I mean, there are two islands really affected by Hurricane Dorian, Grand Bahama and the Abacos, Great Abacos. If you're planning on going on vacation, maybe to Nassau or another island, that's another way to help, because this is a heavily tourism dependent type of a nation. And so, you've got to imagine all the jobs that are being lost right now, and how many people are hurting financially because of that. So even just a simple vacation to the Bahamas would probably help.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much for taking some time with me today. I know you got a busy day, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, join us here next week. We're going to have Paul Pastelok, our long-range meteorologist, joining us to talk about the upcoming winter forecast. See you back here then.